Ethan Hale, a former Navy SEAL living in a lonely cabin high in the Rockies with his canine, Shadow, wanted only silence after losing his wife, his child, and his place in the world. But on the coldest night of the winter, a faint knock slipped through the howling storm. When Ethan opened the door, a young mother collapsed into his arms, 4 freezing children clinging to her, their breaths thin and fading. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment would pull him out of the shadows and rewrite the fate of everyone standing on his porch. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if this story stirs something in you, subscribe for more stories of honor, sacrifice, and bonds that never break. Your support truly means the world. Snow pressed against the Rockies like a white, breathless weight, muffling the world into stillness. Ethan Hale woke before the sound reached him. His body, long trained by war and grief, stirred at the slightest shift in the night. For a heartbeat, he lay still on the old cot, listening to the storm clawing at the window panes. Then it came again, a faint, uneven tapping, almost lost inside the roar of winter. Shadow lifted his head first. The 6-year-old German Shepherd, black and tan fur threaded with silver from old wounds, rose from his place at the foot of the bed. His ears pricked sharply, posture tense, tail low but alert. Shadow had served with Ethan through 2 deployments and carried his own trauma in quiet ways. The slight limp on cold mornings, the soft whine when distant thunder mimicked mortar fire. Now he looked at Ethan with questioning eyes. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, I heard it too." He pushed himself up, the cabin floor cold under his bare feet. At 37, he still had the frame of a Navy SEAL, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who once moved through deserts and war zones like a silent blade. But the sharp angles of his face had softened with loss. His dark blonde hair had grown uneven, and a short stubble shadowed a jaw that seemed permanently set in quiet restraint. There was a heaviness in his blue-gray eyes, the look of a man who had loved deeply and suffered the consequence of loving in a world that took more than it gave. The knock came again. 3 soft taps, then stillness. No one climbed this far up the mountain, certainly not in a blizzard. Ethan pulled on his flannel shirt, grabbed a flashlight and moved to the door. Shadow stayed tight at his heel, a silent guardian. When Ethan opened the door, the world seemed to shatter. A woman crumpled forward into his arms, a young mother severe with hunger and exhaustion, her thin frame almost swallowed by a torn gray winter coat. Her long dark hair, once straight, was now stiff with ice. Snow clung to her eyelashes. Her cheeks were hollow, as if carved by months of fear. Her skin, fair but wind-burned, was nearly gray in the lantern light. She clutched a toddler to her chest, a little girl no older than 2, wrapped in a damp blanket, lips pale blue, limbs stiff with cold. Behind her stood 3 more children, a girl of about 9, tall for her age, thin as a reed, with tangled chestnut hair and eyes too old for childhood. She held tightly to the hands of 2 small boys, twins, perhaps 6, identical in their trembling, their chapped lips, their mismatched clothes. All 4 children were shaking violently, their breath fogging the air like frightened sparrows. The woman tried to speak. No sound came out. Then, barely audible, "Please." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Get inside," he said, steady but urgent. He lifted the woman with one arm, the toddler still clinging to her, and guided her into the cabin. The girl and the twins followed, stumbling across the threshold as though entering another world. Shadow approached them cautiously, nose lowered, tail gentle. The children instinctively huddled closer together, but the dog made no threatening move, only circled them once, checking each small face as if performing instinctive triage. Inside, the cabin was frigid but still warmer than the storm. Ethan worked fast. He threw open the stove door, fed it dry logs, and pumped the bellows until flames leapt upward. The sudden glow lit the single-room home. Rough timber walls, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, shelves sparsely stocked with canned food, and a kettle warming on the stove. "Sit here," Ethan said, guiding the children toward the heat. The woman sank into the nearest chair, clutching the toddler, her breath ragged. The older girl helped the twins to the hearth, rubbing their hands together like she'd done this many times before. Ethan knelt beside the toddler, brushing wet strands of hair from her forehead. She was frighteningly light, her skin cold as a river stone. "Hypothermia," he murmured. Years of battlefield medical training settled into his movements. He wrapped the child in one of his own wool blankets, rubbed her arms and legs gently, checked her pulse, pressed his palm against her sternum to feel for warmth. Shadow lay down beside the toddler, curling his warm body around her. The girl's tiny fingers clutched the dog's fur instinctively. Ethan glanced at the mother. She was watching him with wide, hollow eyes, hazel eyes that once must have been bright but now were rimmed with exhaustion and fear. "My name is Sarah," she whispered at last, voice raw. "Sarah Brennan." Her voice trembled when she spoke again. "Our car died on the road. We walked 1/2 mile. The baby, Lily, she stopped crying. I thought." Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Ethan shook his head gently. "You did everything you could. Let me take it from here." He moved to the kitchen shelf and retrieved the last of his emergency rations, 2 MRE packs and a half-full jar of peanut butter. The twins devoured the food like they hadn't eaten properly in days. The older girl ate more slowly, never taking her eyes from her mother. Sarah watched her children eat with trembling hands. Only when Ethan placed a bowl of warm water beside her did she allow herself to uncoil, just a little. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, breaths softened. Shadows warmed. A cabin meant for 1 man and 1 dog now carried the fragile heartbeat of a family, and Ethan Hale, who came here to disappear, could feel something shift inside his chest, like a long frozen place trying to remember warmth. As the toddler's breathing steadied beneath Shadow's protective weight, Ethan finally understood. His life was no longer silent, and the knock that shattered his solitude was only the beginning. The storm softened by morning, but the cold still clung to the cabin walls like a lingering threat. Ethan Hale moved quietly, tending the fire and checking on the 4 children who slept in a tangled heap near the stove. Shadow lay beside them, the German shepherd's steady breathing serving as a barrier of warmth the children instinctively leaned toward. The dog's fur was tousled, dusted with the faint scent of snow and ash, his brown eyes half open and watchful even in rest. Ethan had spent years in war zones, yet nothing felt as fragile as the sight in front of him. 4 small bodies trying to recover from a night that could have killed them. He exhaled slowly, then glanced toward the only chair in the room. Sarah Brennan sat curled there, the thin wool blanket wrapped around her narrow shoulders. In the morning light she looked even smaller than the night before. Her long dark hair, now dry, fell in uneven waves against her pale cheekbones. Her face, gaunt from weeks of poor meals, had the quiet kind of beauty that came from endurance rather than ease. She sat with both hands wrapped around a chipped mug of warm water, staring into nothing. Ethan approached. "You warm enough?" She nodded, though the truth lived in the faint tremor of her fingers. Sarah had the look of someone held together by sheer will, a thin woman in her late 20s, back straight despite exhaustion, eyes bruised with worry but sharp with maternal vigilance. "I'm sorry," she murmured, voice low. "We took your bed, your food, your heat. I didn't want—" "You did what you had to," Ethan said gently. "That's what parents do." Her gaze drifted to the children, softening in a way that made something tighten in Ethan's chest. She had survived cold nights, empty cupboards, and the cruelty of strangers, yet she still looked at those 4 little ones with tenderness instead of bitterness. Ethan moved around the cabin, gathering the few blankets he had left. As he lifted one, something slipped from the pocket of Sarah's coat. A small folder, edges curled from wear, landed on the floor with a soft thud. Sarah froze. Ethan bent and picked it up, glancing at the label. "Infant found. Trailer Park District. He looked up slowly. Sarah's breath stuttered, her fingers tightening around the mug until her knuckles whitened. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "I'm not thinking anything," Ethan said, his voice even. "But if there's something I should know, now's the time." Sarah lowered her head, her hair falling like a curtain around her face. For a moment she just breathed, as though deciding whether to trust him. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in the middle. "Lily isn't mine." Ethan didn't move. Sarah swallowed hard. "My husband and I lived in a run-down mobile home. We didn't have much, but we had the kids, and we had hope." She took a shaky breath. "One night, about a year ago, I heard crying outside. I went out and found her. Lily, wrapped in a thin towel beside a dumpster. She couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. No note, no name, nobody around." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I knocked on every door in that trailer park. No one admitted anything. Some told me to leave her on the church steps. Some told me the police wouldn't care. One woman said, 'Not my problem.'" Sarah's voice hardened in quiet, trembling anger. "But she was a baby, freezing, alone, so I brought her inside, and from that night on, she was mine." Ethan sat on the edge of the table, the folder in his hands feeling heavier than paper should. He studied Sarah's face, the fear, the shame, the fierce loyalty. This wasn't a woman running from mistakes. This was a woman running from a world that had failed her at every turn. "Holding her," Sarah continued, pressing a hand to her chest, "it changed something in me. I thought I was already a mother of 3, but Lily, she made me feel like I was a mother all over again, like I got a second chance to do something right." Her voice fell to a whisper. "And when my husband died, and the landlord kicked us out, and people stopped opening their doors, I swore I wouldn't let her go, any of them." Ethan stared at the fire, jaw clenched against the emotion rising quietly inside him. He knew what it meant to lose family. He knew the crushing weight of trying to save someone and failing anyway. But Sarah, this thin, exhausted woman, had saved someone who wasn't even hers. She had carried 4 children through snow and hunger and humiliation simply because she refused to abandon them. Shadow lifted his head and nuzzled Sarah's knee, giving a soft groan. Sarah's hand drifted into the dog's fur automatically, as if she'd known him for years instead of hours. Ethan finally spoke. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly, "stronger than most." A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. He set the folder on the table. "Lily's safe now. They all are." Sarah nodded, but her shoulders trembled in silent relief. For a long moment the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of sleeping children. Ethan looked around the room, at Shadow keeping watch, at the children wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of pine, at the fragile woman who had carried more than any soul should bear. Something shifted inside him, like a fault line realigning. These weren't just strangers needing shelter, they were a family on the edge of breaking. And somehow, without meaning to, he had become the only thing keeping them from falling apart. For 3 days, the storm raged and softened in turns, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth began to take root. The air still held the sharp bite of winter, yet the presence of 4 children and the quiet determination of their mother shifted something in the rhythm of Ethan Hale's isolated world. The small space, once hollow and echoing, now carried the soft thuds of little footsteps, the murmured lullabies Sarah hummed under her breath, and the steady pad of Shadow's protective pacing. By morning, the cabin no longer looked abandoned. Sarah Brennan, despite her thin frame and lingering exhaustion, moved with the steady drive of a woman who had rebuilt her life too many times to ever stop trying. Her dark hair, still tangled from the storm, was pulled into a loose braid, revealing the delicate angles of a face shaped by hardship but not defeated by it. She swept dust from neglected corners, tightened loose hinges with Ethan's old toolbox, and washed dishes with snowmelt warmed over the stove. Her movements were quiet but purposeful, as though she had decided the cabin would become a home whether Ethan agreed or not. The children brought life where silence once ruled. Lucy, the 9-year-old, was solemn and alert, always watching her siblings with fierce protectiveness. Her chestnut hair fell messily across her forehead, and her thoughtful brown eyes scanned every small change in the room. She followed Ethan like a shadow during chores, asking questions about firewood and kindling with the seriousness of someone far older. The twins, Sam and Ben, thawed the quickest. They raced around the cabin with clumsy bursts of energy, identical grins flashing whenever Shadow nudged them with his cold nose. The 6-year-olds had the wiry limbs of children used to sleeping in the back seat of a car, but their laughter, new and tentative, filled spaces Ethan thought would never echo again. Lily, the youngest, stayed close to Sarah's side during the day and curled into Shadow's fur each night. Her small hands often gripped the dog's ears gently, as if afraid he might disappear. Shadow, for his part, accepted this role with the gravity of a knight sworn into service. His thick coat, now clean and brushed, glimmered in the firelight, and his amber eyes softened whenever one of the children crawled onto him. Ethan watched all of this with a mixture of awe and guilt. He had not intended for their presence to feel good, yet it did. He found himself teaching Sam and Ben how to stack firewood properly, guiding their small hands with patience he didn't know he still possessed. He showed Lucy how to twist pine shavings into tinder bundles, her brow furrowed with focus. Even Lily seemed to understand something had shifted. She toddled after him on unsteady legs, clutching a wooden spoon like a staff of command. But the warmth of these small moments could not banish the truth waiting outside the cabin door. The world beyond the mountains was still moving, and it was moving toward him. The property tax bill lay folded in Ethan's coat pocket. He had found it the previous morning, buried under a pile of unopened mail he had avoided for too long. The number printed on it had punched the air from his lungs. He owed what he didn't have. Years of unstable work, medical debt from his wife's final days, therapy bills for his own PTSD, and the cost of caring for Shadow's injured leg had all eaten through the savings he once possessed. His part-time security shifts wouldn't be enough. His equipment from the Navy, what little he kept, was worn and not worth selling. And the cabin, despite its rough edges, was the last thing he owned that hadn't been taken by the world already. That night, after Sarah settled the children, Ethan stepped outside to clear his thoughts. The sky hung low, stars buried behind bruised clouds. Snow crunched beneath his boots. He breathed deeply, letting the cold sting his lungs until his heartbeat steadied. When he returned inside, Sarah sat at the table alone. Her posture was tight, as if she had been waiting for a moment she dreaded. She reached into the pocket of her worn coat and placed something small on the table. A ring. A simple gold wedding band, dulled by years of wear, but unmistakably precious. The weight of it on the rough wood seemed disproportionate, as though it carried not metal, but memories. Ethan's chest tightened. Sarah. No. She held up a trembling hand. Please, let me speak. Her eyes, hazel but muted by sorrow, met his with rare steadiness. This was Daniel's, she said softly. My husband. It's the only thing I managed to keep when the landlord threw us out. I've held on to it because it felt like the last piece of him I had. She paused, breath shaking. But my children are alive because of you, because you opened your door when no one else did. If selling this helps you keep this cabin, helps keep them warm, then I want you to take it. Ethan pushed the ring back toward her immediately. Sarah, this isn't yours to give. Her voice cracked. It's all I have left to offer. You already offered everything, he said quietly. You walked miles in a storm. You carried 4 kids when the world pushed you out. You don't owe me this. Tears welled in her eyes. She pressed her lips together hard, as if holding herself together by sheer force of will. Then how will you keep your home? She whispered. Ethan had no answer. The silence that followed was not cold. It was aching, heavy, human. Sarah closed her hand over the ring, clutching it to her chest as though reclaiming a piece of herself. And Ethan realized then that the days ahead would test all of them in ways he had not yet imagined. 4 days after Sarah offered her wedding ring, and Ethan refused it, The storm finally broke. Pale morning sun pressed through low clouds, glazing the snow-covered pines with a cold silver sheen. The world looked peaceful, almost gentle, but Ethan Hale felt anything but calm. The tax notice weighed like an anchor in his pocket, and no amount of wood chopped or chores completed could silence the truth. He had run out of time. He didn't want to leave the cabin, not with Sarah's fragile hope stitched together by such thin thread. But by midday, he saddled his old truck, brushed snow from the windshield, and prepared to drive down the winding trail that led to town. Shadow watched from the porch, tail lowered, reading Ethan's tension the way only a seasoned canine could. The German Shepherd was broad-chested and strong despite his aging limbs, his thick fur catching specks of sun. He gave a low rumble, not a growl, more a warning, before nudging Ethan's leg as if urging him to stay. "I'll be back," Ethan murmured, scratching behind the dog's ear. "Keep them safe." Inside the cabin, Sarah Brennan stood holding Lily on her hip. The toddler, cheeks now pink with returning warmth, pressed her face into Sarah's thin shoulder. Sarah's dark hair, braided loosely down her back, contrasted sharply with the pale skin stretched over her high cheekbones. She still looked worn, still looked scared, but the hollowed-out desperation from the night she arrived had softened. She stepped onto the porch, watching Ethan with anxious eyes. "Do you have to go today?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, forcing steadiness into his voice. "If I don't meet with the assessor now, I won't get another chance before the deadline." Sarah bit her lip. Her slender hands tightened around Lily's small body. "Be careful. People in town, they don't like outsiders." A beat passed. "And they don't like me." Ethan held her gaze. "Then I'll speak for you." She blinked, startled by the firmness in his tone. Before she could answer, Ethan climbed into the truck, and the engine groaned to life. Snow kicked up behind the tires as he drove away, leaving the cabin, and the family it had begun to shelter, growing small in the rearview mirror. The town of Miller's Pass lay nestled in a broad valley, its single main road lined with old brick buildings, a diner with flickering neon lights, and a grocery store with a sagging wooden awning. Behind it all rose the mountains, watching silently as the town pushed through another winter. As Ethan stepped into the county office, a bell chimed sharply. Behind the counter sat Miss Janet Merrill, a woman in her late 50s with a rigid spine, sharp jawline, and hair pinned so tightly it looked painful. Her reading glasses hung halfway down her nose, and she regarded Ethan with the wary look of someone who disliked surprises. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice crisp as frost. "You're late?" "I'm within the grace period," Ethan said, jaw tightening. "Barely." She shuffled paperwork with quick, clipped motions. "Your request for extension was reviewed. Denied." Ethan stared at her, disbelief pushing heat into his face. "I haven't even spoken to the assessor yet." "No need." Miss Merrill pushed a stamped document toward him. "Your payment is due in full." He swallowed hard. "And if I can't pay today? Then the property enters pre-seizure status." He clenched and unclenched his fists. "Look, I've had some complications. I just need a little more time." Janet lifted her chin, eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "Complications like taking in that Brennan woman and her brood?" Something sharp and cold carved down Ethan's spine. "What did you say?" She tapped a pen against the counter. "Everyone's talking about it. A woman with 4 children, showing up half-frozen, reckless, irresponsible." Ethan stepped forward, voice low. "She walked through a blizzard to save her kids. Irresponsible isn't the word I'd choose." Janet's lips thinned. "Well, the town has its opinions. And most of them," Ethan said, "aren't worth the breath it takes to say them." Before Miss Merrill could respond, the door behind her swung open. Deputy Alan Reeves entered. Broad-shouldered, late 40s, with a neat salt-and-pepper beard and a uniform that strained slightly at the seams. He had the look of a man who had seen too many winters and too many lies. Though stern, there was a trace of tired kindness in his brown eyes. "Hale," Reeves greeted. "Heard you're in some tax trouble." "More than some," Ethan admitted. Reeves looked him over, taking in Ethan's stubbled jaw, his worn flannel, the rigid posture of a man bracing against both weather and judgment. He sighed. "Wish I could help, but the county won't bend. Not this year." Ethan inhaled slowly. "Yeah, I figured." As he turned to leave, Janet remarked sharply, "Word of advice, Mr. Hale. If you want to keep your house, perhaps stop collecting strays." He stopped dead. "Say that again," he said softly. Janet blinked, taken aback but not repentant. "Strays. You can't afford them." Ethan stepped forward, voice steady but fierce. "That stray, as you call her, kept her kids alive when no one else lifted a hand. If you think compassion is a liability, maybe the problem isn't her." Reeves cleared his throat, diffusing the confrontation. "Let it go, Hale. Not worth the fight. But it was worth something. It was worth everything." When Ethan returned to the cabin hours later, exhausted and empty-handed, he found Sarah sitting on the floor beside the stove with the children gathered around her. She looked up immediately, reading the truth in his face before he said a word. "They said no, didn't they?" she whispered. He nodded. Silence pressed between them. Then, slowly, Ethan knelt in front of her. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of a decision forming in his chest. "Sarah," he said, voice rough, "you and the kids. You don't have legal protection. If something happens to me, if the county takes the cabin, you'll be homeless again." Her breath hitched. He continued, "But there's one way to protect you, one way to make sure no one can take this home from you." Sarah stared, eyes shining with fearful hope. "Ethan, what are you saying?" He took a shaky breath. "I'm asking you to marry me, not out of romance, out of responsibility, out of truth." He paused, meeting her gaze fully. "Because I want to protect you, all of you." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Ethan, yes." And in that small cabin, where warmth had fought its way back into both air and soul, a new family began to take shape. 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, paperwork, nerves, and a strange, growing sense of belonging. Winter had finally begun to loosen its grip on the Rocky Mountains, and thin threads of sunlight wove through the retreating clouds, promising change. The cabin, once a sanctuary for one man and one aging canine, now felt alive with the restless rhythm of a family preparing for a new beginning. The morning of the wedding was crisp, the air carrying the scent of melting snow and thawing earth. Ethan Hale stood in front of the small mirror nailed crookedly to the cabin wall, smoothing the collar of the only button-down shirt he owned. He was still unmistakably a soldier, tall, broad-shouldered, his jaw strong beneath a short, neat beard he'd trimmed the night before. Yet there was something new in his blue-gray eyes, something softer than the brooding silence that had defined him for years. Hope. Uncertain, fragile, but undeniably present. Shadow sat at his side, watching with attentive stillness. His tan and black coat was brushed until it shone, and someone, likely Lucy, had tied a small strip of white cloth around his neck like a makeshift bow tie. At 6 years old, the German Shepherd carried the calm dignity of a seasoned guardian. The slight limp in his right hind leg was more noticeable on cold mornings, a lingering scar from an explosion overseas, but today he moved with purpose. Today, his family was growing. Outside, Sarah Brennan adjusted the skirt of the simple cream dress Janet Merrill had quietly donated after overhearing about the wedding. The woman had delivered it with stiff formality and the barest hint of apology, a small but surprising gesture. Sarah now stood in a shaft of sunlight, her slender frame straightened with quiet pride. Her dark hair tumbled down her back in loose curls Lucy had painstakingly coaxed into shape with melted snow water and the cabin's only comb. Her hazel eyes, once dim with exhaustion, glowed now with something warm, steady, and bright. The children were arrayed around her like mismatched ornaments. Lucy, the eldest, wore a faded blue dress borrowed from a neighbor and stood tall beside her mother, protective as always. Sam and Ben tugged at the sleeves of their stiff shirts, both boys restless bundles of identical energy and wide grins. And Lily, sweet Lily, sat in Sarah's arms, her small fingers tangled in the fabric of the dress, her cheeks pink with excitement and the afterglow of new health. Ethan joined them outside, and for a moment everything fell silent. Sarah looked up, breath catching just slightly, as if seeing him not only as the man who had saved her family, but as the man who would stand with them through every storm still to come. "You look," she began, voice soft. Ethan cleared his throat. "Presentable?" Sarah laughed, light, genuine, surprising herself. "Better than that." They walked the short distance to the town hall where Reverend Stone waited. He was a man in his early 60s with gentle features, silver hair, and a lined face shaped by years of offering guidance to people who rarely listened. His voice had the warm cadence of a seasoned pastor, and his eyes held the kind of kindness that lived quietly rather than preached loudly. A few town residents gathered, some driven by curiosity, some by obligation, and a handful by genuine care. Mrs. Puig stood stiffly in the front row, pursing her lips but offering no protest. Deputy Alan Reeves leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, nodding once in quiet approval when Ethan caught his eye. Even Janet Merrill had come, though she stayed near the doorway, her posture rigid but her expression thoughtful. Reverend Stone began the ceremony, his voice calm as he spoke about resilience, compassion, and the unexpected ways people find solace in each other. Ethan's gaze never left Sarah's. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. When Stone invited Ethan to speak his vows, Ethan's voice caught for just a heartbeat. Then he inhaled and began. "I can't promise I'll always have the right answers," he said, his tone low but clear. "But I promise you won't face another storm alone. And I promise—" His voice softened. "To protect this family as long as I have breath in me." Before Sarah could respond, a small figure wriggled free from Lucy's grasp. Lily toddled forward on unsteady legs, arms stretched toward Ethan. "Papa!" she squealed. A collective gasp broke into laughter, and Sarah pressed her hands over her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Ethan bent and lifted Lily into his arms. She clung to him, burying her face in his chest, and he closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a feeling so powerful he couldn't have spoken even if he tried. Reverend Stone smiled. "I think the little one approves." Sarah's vows were simpler, spoken through tears. "You gave us a home when we had nothing left. I promise to stand beside you, wherever this life leads." Stone pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan kissed her, a brief, trembling kiss filled with gratitude, fear, and a quiet, growing love. Spring arrived slowly, then, all at once. The snow melted into thick mud, which dried into earth rich and dark. Together, Ethan and Sarah rebuilt the chicken coop, repaired the leaking roof, and planted a small garden. Rows of potatoes, beans, carrots, all carefully covered with straw. The children worked beside them, their laughter echoing against the mountains. Shadow followed Lily everywhere. The toddler, saved once from the cold and once again by the love that found her, toddled after the dog with unshakable devotion. He tolerated every tug of his fur, every clumsy hug, every attempt to feed him imaginary soup from a stick. One warm afternoon, Ethan and Sarah walked to the small cemetery behind the cabin. 2 graves rested beneath an old pine, the final resting place of Ethan's wife and infant son. Sarah knelt, placed a wildflower on the stones, and whispered something too soft to hear. Ethan stood beside her, taking her hand. He was not replacing his past. He was honoring it, while choosing a future. That evening, the family gathered on the porch. Sunset painted the sky in gold and rose. The children sprawled at their feet, Shadow dozing with his head on Lily's lap. Sarah leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever think," she whispered, "that winter brings things for a reason?" Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the mountains darken into silhouettes. "Yeah," he murmured. "Some winters break you, some remake you." He wrapped an arm around her. "And this one gave me everything." Sometimes the greatest miracles arrive in the quietest ways. not as angels with wings of gold, but as ordinary people knocking on our door in the middle of a storm. Or as the strength God places in our hearts when we think we have nothing left to give. Ethan thought winter had taken everything from him. Sarah believed the world had turned its back on her, but Grace found them anyway. Through a faint knock, a shivering child, a loyal dog, and the simple courage to open the door when everything inside whispered to stay alone. Miracles don't always split the sky. Most of the time, they bloom gently in the places we least expect. In small cabins, in tired hands, in second chances, and in the families we build from love, not blood, and maybe. God had been guiding them toward each other the whole time. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who could use a reminder that hope still knocks, even in the darkest winters. Leave a comment, tell us what moved you most, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of courage, kindness, and God's quiet miracles. May the Lord bless you, protect your home, warm your spirit, and guide you to the miracles waiting just beyond your next door.